Born into America's most powerful dynasty, Cornelia Vanderbilt was one of the world's richest women and was expected to live a certain type of life. For a time she did, but then in the 1930s she moved to Europe, divorced her husband, dyed her hair pink, and reinvented herself under a new name. These actions shocked American high society, so why did she do it, and what became of her? Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born on the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina on the 22nd of August 1900. Almost her entire life was shaped by her family background. Her father was the grandly named George Washington Vanderbilt II. Far from being a descendant of the first President of the United States, as his name might suggest, George was actually the son of William Henry Vanderbilt. William Henry was the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt, also known in 19th century America as the Commodore. Cornelius had amassed a vast fortune during a long life before his death in 1877. First, he had monopolized shipping in the tri-state area and along the east coast of the US during the steamship boom between the 1830s and 1850s, and then he had diversified into the railways. Cornelia never knew her great-grandfather or grandfather. William Henry had died in 1885, leaving behind a vast fortune of $200 million, tens of billions in modern terms. Though most of his estate went to two of Cornelia's older uncles, her father had inherited a few million himself, and he acquired more money over the years as relatives passed away and trust funds matured. As such, Cornelia was born into an insanely wealthy family, and she would be able to live however she pleased in later life. Her mother was Edith Stuyvesant Gerry, who hailed from a prominent East Coast political family. She had married Cornelia's father in 1898. Cornelia was their only child, meaning that she stood to inherit the entirety of their fortune in years to come, along with the enormous house and estate George had constructed at Biltmore. Before looking further at Cornelia's eccentric life, let's just backtrack to examine the Biltmore Estate itself. Cornelia's father had built this house before he ever married Edith. He had been drawn to rural North Carolina by his mother. After her husband, William Henry, died in 1885, she started spending more time away from New York, and North Carolina was a popular spot at the time for New Yorkers seeking to escape the hustle and bustle of Manhattan. George liked North Carolina, and when he entered his mid-20s, he decided to buy a large estate here to build his own house on it. He also wanted to match his brothers, who had built large houses in New York and Rhode Island. Work began on the Biltmore Estate at the end of the 1880s, after George had bought up 125,000 acres of land. It was designed by the prominent 19th century architect Richard Morris Hunt, and approximately 1,000 workers were employed during its construction, being built in the style of a French Renaissance chateau. Its architecture drew inspiration from several French Renaissance chateaux of the Loire Valley, particularly the Château de Blois, a historic castle in central France that once served as the residence of the Counts of Blois and several French kings. The house was 4 stories high, with a basement and a sub-basement. There were approximately 250 rooms at Biltmore House, including 35 bedrooms, over 40 bathrooms, staff quarters for dozens of staff, a banqueting hall, a music room, a library with tens of thousands of books, massive kitchens and laundry rooms, a billiard room for playing pool, and even a swimming pool, an unusual feature in the 1890s. It was finished in 1895 and named after De Bilt, the town the Vanderbilts came from originally in the Netherlands. This enormous house was the world Cornelia grew up in as an only child, and once she stepped beyond its doors, she could wander for miles without ever leaving the vast estate. Then and now, it stood as the largest privately owned home in the United States. For all its grandeur though, it was a curious place to be a child. No siblings, few equals, and a daily life shaped instead by the constant presence of attentive adults and household staff, an upbringing that could hardly help but leave its mark. And leave its mark it did, as Cornelia would become quite eccentric in later years and abandoned her childhood mansion, as we shall soon see. Cornelia grew up on Biltmore Estate and was privately tutored in her early years there. She was a single child, but she was surrounded by staff and visitors, while in the summer and during the holidays, other members of the larger Vanderbilt dynasty visited the estate. In her teens, she started to attend the Madeira School. This was an elite, private preparatory and boarding school for girls in Virginia that had been established a few years earlier. There she was exposed to wider experiences with girls her own age, though even by then Cornelia was known for being a bit eccentric. Cornelia and her parents had a close call in 1912. They were holidaying in England and were scheduled to depart home on board the Titanic, the reputably unsinkable ship that sank on its maiden voyage to New York. Instead, Cornelia's father decided to book them on a separate ship home a week earlier. It's likely that he did this because of a scheduled coal miners' strike which was feared could leave the Titanic and other transatlantic steamliners stranded in port for weeks. Had he not changed their plans, Cornelia and her parents could have ended up as three of the victims of the most famous naval disaster in history. George Washington Vanderbilt II did not outlive the victims of the Titanic by long though. Cornelia's father died in March 1914, aged 51, as a result of complications from an operation to remove his appendix that resulted in a blood clot in his lung. George left behind a $50 million estate, including Biltmore. Much of this was transferred to Edith initially, who remarried in the 1920s and moved away from Biltmore. Cornelia was given an allowance during her teen years, but she was scheduled to start receiving $2 million a year from 1921 onwards and would also acquire Biltmore. Thus, by the early 1920s, Cornelia was poised to ascend into the ranks of the world's wealthiest women, her fortune swelling to a scale few of her contemporaries, male or female, could rival. Cornelia attended the University of North Carolina for about a year after finishing at Madeira, though she never finished a degree there. In the early 1920s, she ended up meeting and then marrying her first husband, who was 10 years her senior. John Francis Amherst Cecil was a descendant of one of England's most esteemed political and aristocratic families. He served as first secretary of the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. in the mid-1920s, and it was because of this that he met and married Cornelia in April 1924. Their wedding was held at Biltmore and was a grand affair with thousands of guests and staff in attendance. At the time, Cornelia was 23, while John was 33. A year and a bit later, when Cornelia turned 25, she received her full inheritance from her father. This was $5 million, which would be nearly $100 million in today's money. Up until this point, Cornelia's life was exactly what was to be expected of a wealthy heiress. She received a high-level education, although she didn't get her degree, married a wealthy man of her social class, was engaged in a variety of philanthropic activities, and soon became the lady of the manor at Biltmore. She then had two sons with her husband, George and William, born in 1925 and 1928. The pair enjoyed a comfortable life at Biltmore, but in 1930, amid the Great Depression, they opened portions of the house to the public to generate extra income, an unprecedented move that helped secure the future of America's largest home, which would later be recognized as a National Historic Landmark. Yet, as the children began to grow up, Cornelia's eccentric behavior became even more apparent. In 1932, when her boys were 7 and 4 years of age respectively, she decided that life at Biltmore was boring and no longer fulfilling her. Thus, she left suddenly to New York and began attending art school there. This was a highly unusual move at the time. A theory is that Cornelia might have decided to leave Biltmore because she felt stifled by life there. She had managed the estate for a while herself in the early 1920s, but after marrying, her husband took over the management of Biltmore, and this left her twiddling her thumbs during the day. Cornelia had no interest in being a demure housewife, albeit a wealthy one, and she decided to establish her own independent life in New York. Cornelia did not remain in New York for long though. A few months after arriving there, she left for Europe and settled in Paris. She would never return to the United States, not even to attend her mother's funeral after she died in 1958. Cornelia also decided she was done with her husband. She divorced Cecil in 1934, shortly after arriving to Europe. Strangely though, he remained at Biltmore, and managed the estate even after divorcing Cornelia. More puzzling still was her adoption of the name Nilcha and the dyeing of her hair pink. This reflected her growing belief in the power of numerology and mysticism, and both the colour of her hair and name were reflections of her alleged colour aura. Later she dyed her hair blue, and her clothing choices were often vibrant colours, depending on her aura and the time of the year. Her children, meanwhile, were educated in Britain and Switzerland, meaning that Cornelia did see them regularly in Europe. During their holidays they would return to Biltmore to be with their father, so they lived a transatlantic life. Both of them served in the British Royal Navy during the Second World War, a knock-on effect of Cornelia's wanderlust. Cornelia became known for a complex love life in Europe. In Paris she began a relationship with the Swiss artist Guy Bert. Later, when the Second World War broke out, she moved across the English Channel and made Britain her adopted home. Her two sons barely survived the conflict. In 1943 they had been sent from neutral Switzerland through Vichy France and neutral Spain to Portugal. This way they could board a plane in Lisbon and fly to England to be with their mother there. However, they were unexpectedly bumped from the flight they were meant to take by the actor Leslie Howard, famed for his role in Gone with the Wind. That very plane was later shot down by the Nazis over the Bay of Biscay, killing all on board. George and William instead travelled on a separate aircraft and reached England safely, an astonishing twist of fate that echoed Cornelia's own brush with a disaster when she nearly boarded the Titanic in 1912. Once again, catastrophe had passed her family by at the narrowest of margins. After the war, she married Captain Vivian Francis Bulkley Johnson in 1949. He was a decorated war hero from his service during the First World War, who later built a successful career in banking in London. Cornelia's second wedding couldn't have been more different from the first. She and Vivian were married in a registry office in Kensington in London. She decided to go by the name Mary during her second marriage. Why is not 100% clear, though some have suggested it was to keep her life as private as possible. The marriage was seemingly happier than her first. At least, Cornelia Nilcha Mary did not get bored and abscond to a different continent. Instead, she remained by Vivian's side, the two staying married until his death in 1968, marking the longest and calmest chapter of her remarkably unconventional life. Cornelia and Vivian lived between a large house in London and an estate she had purchased in the Cotswolds region of Oxfordshire, called the Mount. They had somewhat eccentric collecting habits here, though of a kind which could only be funded by Cornelia's immense wealth. For instance, the house was adorned by an ever-growing collection of historic Chinese vases. These were later donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. After her husband died in 1968, Cornelia became more interested in the novel concept of art therapy. She became friends with a major advocate of this new form of therapy, Edward Adamson. It was while having dinner with him one night in London that she met William Godser. He was their waiter on that occasion and was 26 years younger than Cornelia. In 1972, she married him when she was 72 and he was 46. They settled into a quiet life together at her home, the Mount. This third marriage would be her last. Cornelia died 3 and a bit years later on the 7th of February 1976, at 75 years of age. While a huge number of her large extended Vanderbilt family were interred in the family crypt on Staten Island back in America, Cornelia again broke with tradition. After her death in Oxfordshire, she was cremated, and her ashes were laid to rest at a church near her home. Years later, following the death of her much younger husband William Godser in 1984, her remains were reunited with his, placed upon his coffin and buried together in Orkney, Scotland. She had largely disavowed her Vanderbilt ties and chosen to live privately for the second half of her life, and this was a fitting end. Why she chose to live this way though remains a mystery to this day. Her marriage to Cecil, who died in 1954 and was buried locally near Biltmore, was clearly unhappy, and she had enough money that she was able to break entirely with convention and pursue her own path. Cornelia lived a strange life, and it is fitting that there is a peculiar story that has surfaced in recent years concerning her. Believe it or not, there is a piece of her wedding cake still on display at the Biltmore Estate to this day. Now you might ask how in the world a piece of cake has survived for a century, and that would be a reasonable question. The answer is that Cornelia's wedding cake when she married Cecil in 1924 was a fruitcake. These include a fair dash of alcohol like whiskey that preserves the cake over time. In fact, the average fruit cake is baked several weeks before it is meant to be consumed. A piece of cake ended up being put into a tin that was forgotten about and left in a trunk. It was found back in the mid-2010s and had the appearance of cheese, but it wasn't, and unlike most food, it had not disintegrated after nearly 90 years. An investigation revealed it was a bit of the wedding cake, and it's on display at Biltmore today, a fitting testament to the life of an eccentric woman. As mentioned, Cornelia's first husband died in 1954, and after his death Cornelia's sons took over the management of the Biltmore Estate. George and William then began to operate the residence as a historic house museum, and worked to stabilise and build the business into a profitable, self-sustaining enterprise. Finally, in 1963, the estate was designated a National Historical Landmark. Through George and William, Cornelia had 8 grandchildren, and today several of her descendants are involved in managing the estate, which remains a major tourist attraction in North Carolina, with around 1.4 million visitors annually. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Cornelia Vanderbilt. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.